Zach, we're back before the season kicks off, or I guess it's already kicked off for you guys. Hasn't kicked off for us yet, but you have a game in the books, maybe more by the time you're watching this. But we have rules to dominate your 2024 seasons and beyond. Dynasty, we got to think about the long term as well as what's right in front of us right now. But before we get into it, I hope that y'all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below some of your favorite rules for dominating your Dynasty season, whether you're newer or not. We want to know some of your favorite strategies on how you dominate your seasons. And also, we want to see you over in that Discord, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in there for a free 7-day trial. Don't miss out on the week 1 shenanigans that will certainly be afoot in there. With all that said, all the promo in the books, let's get straight to the content that people came for. Your first rule to dominate the fantasy football season in 2024. What do you got for us?
Well, I figured, Bob, that I'd have to make this point first.
Fitting.
Because my first rule is be first to everything. In every way, shape, or form, this rule is so very important. As the great Ricky Bobby said, if you're not first, you're last. This is so true in Dynasty. There are only 11 and sometimes 9 other teams to compete with. There's not 31 other teams like it is in the NFL. There's only 9, or there's only 11, or there's only 13. Obviously you comprise one of those teams. So, if you want to rebuild, Bob, and someone else does it first, they acquire 3 first-round picks. It's now very unlikely that that person that acquired the 3 first-round picks is going to deal those 3 first-round picks to you, because you're probably trying to sell off pieces to acquire picks. And it's that much harder to get other teams' first-round picks, as now you're casting a much smaller net, because only 8 other teams have a first-round pick, if even that. So if you're rebuilding, you want to be the first team to do that in your league. And then if you're in a competing situation, Bob, and you're waiting to buy a piece to win it all, and the main team that's rebuilding kind of unloads their players to someone else, you lose out on 2 ways. Not only did you potentially lose out on the rebuilding, on the competing piece that you need on the rebuilding team, but now somebody else in your league has gotten stronger while you haven't. So again, the best way to do this is be the first team to buy from a rebuilding team, if that's the situation you find it in. So, you could apply this to so many different things. You could apply this to like the waiver wire. You could apply this to buying fab and through trades. You could apply this by packaging deals and moving up from a 4th to a 3rd round pick. This applies to almost everything. If you're not first in your league, you're last. And I think I provided a couple of good examples of how that applies, but you just don't want to be behind the 8 ball on this rule. Whether you're competing, whether you're rebuilding, you want to be the first to ascertain that they're, moving pieces for draft capital before someone else does it, or you want to be the first to buy winning and competing pieces if you are in a situation where you're trying to win or trying to compete. Because again, if you don't do that, you now are working with one hand tied behind your back. You don't know how many other teams are trying to rebuild. You don't know how many other teams are trying to offload pieces, and now you've missed out on that opportunity. So, Bob, be first, and be first to everything in your dynasty leagues.
What you're talking about here is these instances being slow to the punch. What happens here is there's increased scarcity that comes to the market, increased scarcity with whether you're a rebuilding team or a contending team. If you're trying to, compete, like you noted, and trying to find assets to buy to help your team, and rebuilding teams already selling off assets, you're in trouble. Same goes the other way if contending teams are trying to sell off their first. It's just a nasty place to be. And a running theme that will go in with all these points: being active, paying attention to the actions of your league mates will be necessities to dominating your league. But paying attention to your league mates and being active in your leagues is a great first step. And I would call it a necessity. Moving on to this next point here, and you'll kind of tie into this one with your next one too. We got some synergy going. I love it. And this is about if you're going all in, and this might not be as much for a dominating this year topic, but if you want to continue to dominate your leagues, one of the worst things you can do if you are trying to go quote unquote all in, I have one bit of caution. Don't go all in. And if you've been around Dynasty for a while, you probably know what I'm talking about. The crazy, insane moves where you're either spending too much to get a player who's not going to be around that long, or you're just paying buku bucks to go get X stud, which I hate a lot less, because with this concept, how I like to rebuild correctly is if I'm getting a veteran in the league, been around, a top tier assets, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, so on and so forth, whatever the case is. They're still younger. They're going to be around for a while. I'm willing to, I still don't want to overpay, but sometimes you have to for studs like that. I still don't want to overpay, but for guys like the Mike Evans, the Stephon Diggs, the guys names we always throw out as those great consequential competitive assets, I don't want to overpay for those guys. I don't want to be sending first round picks for those guys anymore. And for teams that if they're selling me those players by the end of their playoff run because they feel like they've come short, they need to get out on those players or they're not going to get much for them. So you have some bit of leverage there where you don't have to, but if you're buying them at the arms race, I just don't want to invest everything I have into these older aging assets. So even as you go building up these rosters, you build a studly, super strong playoff lineup, anything can go awry for you or other teams. Players can underperform, injuries happen, other teams blow up. I want to make my competitive push as good as it possibly can be without being left with absolutely nothing. I'm not saying you have to still try to compete and walk into next year's draft with 2 first-round picks, 3 seconds, 4 thirds. You get it. But I want to have something on the back end in my tank for the offseason because, as we talk about so frequently, once the season takes over, the rookie picks hold a lot more value. And if nothing else, I want to be able to have a little bit of leverage in the offseason to try to make moves as I see fit. Rex Burkhead's happened. Justin Jackson's happened. Amari Cooper putting up 50-some points happened. George Pickens putting up 40-some points a week. It happens. We talk about it a lot, where if you get to the playoffs, a lot can happen, good or bad. You're going to talk about some stuff with playoffs and luck and things of that sort, maybe. But if you're going to make big expenditures that take away your depth and draft capital to strengthen your lineup, at least make sure you're buying into those long-lasting assets like I talked about. Competitive tight ends, Mark Andrews, Sam Laportas, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, guys like that. You got your wide receivers that I mentioned at the top, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, etc. Don't drain the well for the short-term fixes. The Mike Evans, Cooper Kupps, older running backs, things of that sort. Anybody that once the season realistically ticks over, that their value is going to be shot because they're old, they're washed, whatever the case is. I get sometimes you have to make moves. And if you have assets in the bank, I don't mind doing that. I don't mind acquiring these guys, but I don't want to take all that I have, put it into one push, because once you get to the dance, man, the other teams that are there for a reason. They're there because they're good teams. They're probably good enough managers. And another alternative to just buying new assets using draft picks is to just trying to tier up, improving the assets you already have. This can be just a little bit more of a cost-effective way to improve your lineup, and you can use this with possibly moving injured players who aren't helping your roster, who might help another team who's looking next year. You might be able to also get a younger player back in return, as opposed to only being able to sell for a higher-tiered player, or a older player, I should say, in that instance. So, Zach, feel free to touch on this before diving into our next point. It kind of plays off this one well, but feel free to add any thoughts before you roll on into your next one.
Yeah, I've seen this, and I've seen it too, where it has worked for a team. They win a championship, but at the expense of them really competing over the next 5 years. And that's how I look at all dynasty snapshots the next 5 years. So look, I get this. This is not something I would ever do. I agree with this point. I won't sell out to win a championship, because while you do get those bragging rights, I'm very confident in my abilities to win 2 championships or 3 championships over a 4 or 5 year span of time if I maintain my dynasty teams properly. That kind of bleeds into my next point, Bob, which is really invest your time and your resources into a long-term plan. Like I said, I look at everything in dynasty as a 4 or 5 year window. I don't talk about 10-year windows, although there are those certain players like Marvin Harrison Jr. That's a guy you can plug into your lineup probably for the next 10 years. We don't really know, but we can speculate on that. You can't say that you can start David Njoku for the next 10 years. You just can't say that, because you don't know what's going to happen. Really, you are looking at a 4 or 5 year window here for your dynasty teams. I almost never look at my dynasty teams in a redraft mentality, Bob. You need to be invested in some kind of a long-term plan, one way or the other, whatever that is to you. You need some kind of a roadmap when you're playing Dynasty. If you're watching this video and you're saying to yourself, in this league, I don't necessarily have a plan. You need to get one. You need to know what's going to happen to you if you go 5-0 or if you go 0-5. You need to know that my plan is if I go 0-5, XYZ, or my plan is if I go 5-0, XYZ. You shouldn't just be winging it. Okay? Most people that win at Dynasty don't do it by happenstance. Yes, there is the exception to the rule where somebody wins and it's totally luck, and they were the 6th seed and they were 6-7 or 6-8 in the regular season. That will happen. There's only 12 teams. That will happen, but it's not going to happen a majority of the time or even that often. Luck is a part of this game. There is no denying it, Bob. I always say, or I didn't say this. I say it now, but somebody said this to me, where it says it takes skill to get to the playoffs and it takes luck to win a championship. And I was like, you know what? That's pretty accurate. I like that. But I'm a firm believer that skill, research, homework, a community, they all play a part in a long-term plan of succession in Dynasty. And that's why I love Dynasty. I play, listen, this is really like my place to go outside of work or outside of whatever's happening to me in real life. And so I play Dynasty because it's fun. It distracts me. It keeps me engaged in these ways because I have 30 teams, but before I had 3 teams or 5 teams, and I needed to have a plan for each one. So I needed to say, this is my rebuilding team. This is my competing team. This is we're going to see what happens when I get to the playoffs kind of team. So having a long-term plan, Bob, does one of 2 things. It lets me know that I am on the right path to competing, or if it's been years of me being stuck in the middle, then I know that my approach and my processes aren't working. And I'm basically donating my money to someone else's pockets. You should know, within every season, am I on the right path to competing? Even if I'm in the first year of a rebuild, I am on the path. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Even if it's 2 years away, I can see that light. Or I am 6-6 again for the second year in a row. What am I doing wrong? Now you need to formulate a long-term plan because what you're doing isn't working. So you need to have a cardinal direction, Bob. You need to have a compass pointing north in Dynasty. You can't just wing it by the seat of your pants and expect to be successful and competitive year in and year out. Again, that last statement is so important. Anybody can win any year in Dynasty. I'm trying to be competitive in a 4 or 5 year window straight. That's what every one of my teams, that's their direction. Sometimes I will not win a championship in those 4 or 5 years, and I will have to come up with a new long-term plan. That's just the name of the game. This isn't a foolproof plan. This doesn't work 100% of the time. Nothing is guaranteed. But if I just put myself in a position to win for 4 or 5 years, anything can happen in those 4 or 5 years. And you know what, Bob? I have won championships. I have won back-to-back championships in certain leagues. In our Rewinders League, I made the playoffs both years, and I just saw Jonathan Taylor got injured the first week of the playoffs 2 years ago. Michael Pittman got injured the first week of the playoffs last year. It just happens. That's just the name of the game. But I am in a position to compete again this year in that league. And that's what I'm trying to do. I need to have a plan for the next few years. And even if that plan is, hey, I'm going to be competitive for 1 more year and then it's time to turn the page on this team, that's a long-term plan. But there are just teams that are like, I'm just going to see how this goes over the next – you're pretty much a lot of times going to be stuck in the middle in those situations. And that's really not where you want to be. Just like you want to be first to everything, you don't want to be last. You don't want to be stuck in the middle in Dynasty, Bob. So I always have a plan for each one of my 33 or 34 teams, however many of them. They all have a plan that I'm going to be following through for the next 3-4 years.
I think this boils down to a discussion we have frequently too about trajectories and making moves that fit those trajectories. But establishing your trajectory in the first place does a lot of things for you because it puts players into certain buckets, puts expectations for players into certain buckets. How long is this player going to be worthwhile on a rebuilding team versus a competitive team, and where values truly lie with certain players? Because we do these buy, sell, hold, avoid videos all the time. And quite frankly, there's a discussion for almost every single point for every single player we talk about. There's very rarely this player is just a 100% avoid unless they're, ranked 200 plus on Keep Trade Cut or, something like that, where they're just, really, they should just be an avoid for most reasons. Not on an NFL roster, probably safe to avoid that player. There's just so many different ways that, depending on what your team is, your league formats, things of that sort, and that boils down to the trajectories. Every player can mean something different, and having this plan in mind can kind of help you. It's very overwhelming to have all of these players and all of these avenues you can go down. But if you can isolate just your team trajectory, that cuts out a lot of fluff from what you have to do and can just isolate the better moves to make, especially if you can decipher what those players, where those players kind of fall in those buckets of competing, non-competing, stash, pass. You get it. With that said, Zach, we'll roll right into my next point here, talking about the activity, paying attention to league mates, pay attention to your league, and specifically here, paying attention to your league mates' interests. And you talked about this in our moves to make video this past week, where somebody traded for Deshaun Watson. So you approached them and you're like, hey, Deshaun Watson has not been a model of health the last 2 years. How would you like a fresh, signed, sealed, delivered Jameis Winston? And they took the deal. You were able to make a deal. You were able to get value out of that. So that's just one example. But when you're looking at waivers, what players are managers bidding on when it comes to their fab? Who are they targeting on these waivers in general? Are you getting them, or what positions are they targeting? Whatever the case is, if you add someone via fab and maybe it was a even bid, but you don't really want the player and you're like, well, I'll trade you this guy for such and such. It just gives you that bit of leverage, even if you don't make a deal right then and there. Keep in mind, any interest, big or small, anything can help sway a deal. Any little sprinkle of pizzazz on top of an existing deal could help sway a trade deal from not getting done to getting done. The same thing can be said if this manager, or you're in conversations with a manager about a trade, they counter a player, adding another player specifically. Even if you don't complete that trade with that player in mind that they added to the deal, keep that in mind, because at one point in time, they had interest. If they flick the little heart icon that says, I show interest in this player, keep that in mind down the road for existing deals, whatever the case is. If they cold call you with an offer, it's nice if they show up in your DM and you can just kind of sort through, and it's like, all right, who is this crazy guy tried to trade me for in the past time? I need to free up roster space. I'm trying to make a deal with this player that he has this guy that I want to add to my roster for whatever reason. He wanted this player before. Can we structure a deal around these assets? And keep in mind of the league chatter. If you talked about it before, if they're talking about, hey, I'm a rebuilding team, or hey, I'm trying to compete this year. One of the best ways to make deals is just listen to what your trade partner is saying. And if they're not saying anything, I don't have much advice for you. Maybe find new league mates, but definitely keep those things in mind. All of these things play a role, can help you make a deal, as opposed to, there's going to come time this year where you need something added to your roster, whether it's points for next year, being, younger prospects or future draft capital, whatever the case is, or you need points now. Some point, there's going to be an injury. There's going to be a bye week. You're going to have lineup trouble. You're going to have next year troubles. Having these set aside already can kind of shortcut that highway for you to go make a deal, as opposed to, man, I don't know what to do now. And then you get yourself into trouble. Just another way to keep yourself on top of things. Zach, I know you're a big fan of, all these little quirks you can kind of use to, keep your league mates in check, so to speak, I guess you could say, and keep an eye on what they're doing. Zach, feel free to touch on this one before you move on to your next point. Again, kind of in the same synergistic mind here. What are you thinking?
Look, this is definitely something with my last point I'm going to get into. But I love that you brought back the example of last week, because I just don't know what can encapsulate more what you're talking about than that. We're not really talking about here, like, yes, you can pay attention to who's interested in Justin Jefferson. Absolutely. You should be doing that anyways. Like, that's just the game. But when you can really maximize those little opportunities, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the breadcrumbs that can take us from rebuilding to competing. Or we're looking for the breadcrumbs that can take us from competitor to league favorite or first round bye in the playoffs. Those are the things that we're talking about. How the difference makers that can take you from one step to another in your league. And being able to capitalize on Jameis Winston, who at any moment can just vanish off the dynasty ether. cease to exist in Dynasty, not in real life, in Dynasty, okay? And yes, you can sit here and say, well, Deshaun Watson could miss time and Jameis Winston could. I'm not going to bank on that. And even then, what is the max that you can get when that happens? What is the max that you could have gotten for a Jake Browning last year? I mean, we're maybe a second-round pick. Yeah. Maybe. You're not getting a first-round pick. So I got a third-round pick for Jameis Winston, and I think I gave a fourth-round back. I can't remember what it was. But, you need to jump on those opportunities. And, yeah, this point definitely flows into mine, which is, you're talking about checking in with your league mates and being in tune to them. Well, for me, you have to be plugged in, connected, and involved with what's happening around the NFL at all times. And again, I'm going to definitely talk about this more in my last point here, because to me, there's two different ways to approach these points. This seems very cliche, but man, has this been able to pay dividends in some instances? Were you able to get Brock Purdy on the cheap when he was ascending 2 years ago? Once he signs that contract extension next offseason, I mean, he is worth a lot. And he will be worth more than what he is now because he doesn't have that security of a contract. So were you able to buy in on Colby Parkinson this offseason when the Rams signed him to a $22 million deal? I know you're probably like, Colby Parkinson? But yes, he's the Rams tight end 1 right now and will probably be for a good amount of the regular season. Look, I'm not saying he's a top 10 tight end, but he's definitely the Rams tight end 1 right now until Tyler Higbee comes back. And I just brought up Sam Darnold. Were you able to buy Sam Darnold when it was reported that he was going to be competing for the quarterback job in Minnesota? I have a good amount of Sam Darnold shares because that report came out, and I was like, you never know what's going to happen. If it was me, if I was Minnesota, I would not start J.J. McCarthy this year. Didn't predict the injury. I'm not going to say that, but I was pretty – I think this offseason I had 2 quarterback predictions. Gardner Minshew was going to be the Raiders quarterback. I called that one the moment he signed. Everyone fought me in the Discord. And I was like, dude, why would you pay Gardner Minshew $20 million? Like, what are you talking about? To back up Aiden O'Connell? Come on.
Is he really making that much? Yeah, 2 years, $25 million.
See?
I mean, they have a lot of backup. They have a lot of outs, but it's still a lot of money. I mean,
what was the guarantee?
It's 15 mil. Okay. So
it's pretty good.
So it's a big old deal.
It's a 1 year, $15 million contract. Who's doing that for a backup quarterback? Yeah. So, these were the kinds of things that. So him and Sam Darnold were 2 quarterbacks that I did. If I needed a quarterback 3, I was buying this offseason. With Gardner Minshew, I also bought Aiden O'Connell a lot of places too, just to be safe. So being in tune with what's going around the NFL, Bob, it just brings you value opportunities, whether you want to keep those players or turn those players into other opportunities, such as other players you believe in or more draft capital. It's just an opportunity to buy opportunity, as I like to say. This to me, this is a very practical point, but it's really made the difference for me in a lot of leagues. It's kept me competitive. It's helped me. Just find those difference makers. Another good example last year was Puka Nacua. Like you were drafting Puka Nacua if you had five rounds in your rookie drafts. Not many people drafted Puka Nacua in the 4th round of their leagues. A lot of Puka Nacua's was 5th round, 6th round, or waiver wire pickups. And you picked up Puka Nacua off waivers because you were hearing pretty decent things in the rookie training camp. So look, like I said, this is going to bleed into one of my points at the end, my very last point. But you got to be plugged into what's happening in the NFL, in training camp, in preseason, so on and so forth. Like who's getting the starts, who's getting the first team reps, who's getting the third team reps. Those things are important at this time of the year, but all times of the year, Bob.
I love that you brought up that Puka point. I was actually just writing it down because you're 100% right. If he wasn't drafted late, and even if he was drafted late, he was still very accessible for a long time before we really got into the season, was when people were like, oh man, should I send a first for this guy? Or should I take a first for this guy? We were a couple weeks into the season before people were really on that bandwagon. So there was a nice window of opportunity. If you were following the beat reports, things of that sort. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't love this. This is the 100th percentile outcome of what can happen if you're paying attention to beat reports and things like that. So I don't love hanging our hat on this, but there's plenty of other points where it's, Sam Darnold was rumored to be the starting quarterback for a very long time before the J.J. McCarthy injury even happened. So there was a large window where Sam Darnold could have been even bought because people were doubters or sold because he was going to be the starter over JJ, but now he's worth even more. So argue your point on that all you want. Either way, fact of the matter is paying attention doesn't hurt. And one thing that did a great job of that for me this year, and, not to toot my own horn or anything like that, but my projections, I had to dive into so many things, reports, contracts, projecting starters, things of that sort. These projections available, by the way, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. In the gold tier, you can also purchase them at Patreon as well. Gave me such a new perspective on the expectations I should have for players. And I'm not going to act like my projections are 100% right. But at the end of the day, I put a bunch of numbers into a Google sheet and it came up with rankings of projections that are not far off consensus. So I obviously did something right. I didn't tweak anything to like bump anybody up because, oh, he's way too low. Outside of just a few quirks to make things, I had like caps, so I dialed things back sometimes. But, that gave me a very larger perspective, a more in-depth perspective than I feel like I've ever had coming into a season. So you don't have to go as crazy in depth as I did by any stretch of the imagination, but just any bit of like light projecting you can do to really sit down with start with a couple teams and just kind of, well, how do I think this can play out? And paying attention to reports that happen all off season, contract signings, things of that sort, all are great points and little avenues. You talked about breadcrumbs. This is one of them that can just help that little bit. It's not, there are big sweeping things that really make impacts, but it's little things like this over and over and over, compounding power of consistency. We've talked about that in the past as well. It's a great point, Zach. Moving on to my next one. I hate hoarding. So here we're using a minimalist mindset to maximize value. What the heck does that mean, Bob? And quite frankly, it just means too often I think dynasty managers fall victim to a hoarder's mindset. You talk about it a lot, FOMO. I think a lot of people are worried that, man, if I cut this guy or if I trade this guy, what if he becomes more valuable after he's left my roster? And it's like, that's a game you got to play sometimes because too often we end up holding on to more assets than we need to and for a much longer time than we need to. Some guys just have no business being on rosters. We talk about our keep trade cut video that is a pretty frequently occurring video. I think we'll have a couple in store as we get into the season. But ultimately, this leads to overcrowding on rosters, unnecessary cuts, and wasted time with no value return. Unnecessary cuts being if you have just a lot of players, you are going to cut the wrong one. And if you naturally over time, you're just going to have a little bit more draw to the player. I've held on to this guy for this long. That sunk cost fallacy playing a role as well. Sunk cost fallacy and FOMO. It's a dangerous duo, not one I want to tangle with. But the last thing I ever want is to have a player's value die on my roster and cut them without any value in terms of value return, in terms of assets. I want to get something back for every player I acquire or get on my roster. But at the end of the day, that's just sometimes not going to happen, especially with that bottom end of our roster. So I think too often we feel the need for more quantity as opposed to quality. A big quality guy, quality control guy. Because if I have all these players that could be something eventually, one of them will pan out. But that's not necessarily the facts. But instead, I could be trying to combine some of these assets, whether they're with the players that be draft picks, whatever the case is, and work my way up the ladder to improve my overall roster with pieces that get little bits of hype here and there. Play off Zach's previous point. If you don't believe in a player that you happen to have on your roster that's getting hype over the offseason, trade him, tier up to somebody who you do believe in, who's not necessarily getting the hype, which I don't like buying anti-hype necessarily, but somebody who's just not necessarily getting talked about, people are maybe just a little more down on, do something like that, tier up that little bit and just find ways to get better players on your roster. And on top of that, I think we need to make a strong differentiation between starting depth and just bodies. Depth on the roster, stashes, guys that aren't necessarily doing much for anyone right now, but they might have some upside down the road. With all that said, I think we believe that we need more depth than we actually do to win championships. You need a strong starting lineup and some depth that you want to be putting into starting lineups every week. You don't want to, have your depth be a bunch of Zay Jones level players. You want to have guys that you are actively wanting to put into your lineup every week. And that's provided your whole lineup is healthy. Obviously, during bye weeks, you're not going to be making those considerations, or if a player is injured, but you want to have better starting depth if you're trying to win a championship. So depending on league settings, it might be significantly more or less difficult. Obviously, if you have deep starting lineups, you're going to need some less sexy players coming into your flex spot here and there, just to fill in and help out. But if it's a short, shallow starting lineup, like start 8, start 9, that's occasions where you really, there's so many conversation with roster reviews, pin comment below, YouTube description box, if you want your roster reviewed by one of us. There's so many rosters where it's a 3-round rookie draft or even a 5-round rookie draft, and it's to start 8 or 9. And I'm like, don't ever care about your 4th or 5th round picks, because as much as you drafted Puka Nacua last year, if it's anything more than a start 10 league, you're not finding anything that's likely going to find a home in your starting lineup, unless it's a very rough home league where they just let all the value slide or a bunch of inexperienced players. But I'm not going to talk about the minority of leagues. I'll talk about the majority of things that I believe are realistically going to happen in competitive leagues. Obviously, outliers exist. So with all that said, get these guys off get these losers off my rosters. Pay attention to the keep trade cut videos that are rolling out. We're going to be talking about players that are very over rostered more frequently than they should be. Because I just, in the last year or two, I don't know when it happened, but I'm just like, why do I have Marquez Valdes-Scantling on any roster? He's never been more than a wide receiver 50 something, and players of that ilk, not just Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but plenty of players that are just, they're touted for their upside, this, that, the other thing. They could blow up any week. If it's not a best ball league, who cares? Like, you're never going to get the right week unless you just happen to get lucky, and that's where luck comes into play. So Zach, feel free to talk about this, keeping your roster nice and tidy. Like I said, I'm anti-hoarding. I don't want to keep that filth on my lineup longer than I have to. And projections help me a lot with this too, I'll be honest. A lot of players that a lot of people are talking about that I don't see doing jack this year. So apologies if you've seen the projections and some of your favorite quote-unquote stashes are lowly rated, because they are. But Zach, feel free to touch on this before you dive into your next point.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep this within your league parameters, right? If you're able to roster 40 or 50 players, then sure, roster 40 or 50 players. But there's still a couple teams in almost every league that you go to their team page and it's like, you need to cut 3 players. It's like, hey, there's games this week, man. You got to make some roster moves on here. You got to trim the fat a little bit. Whether that's, moving guys onto your taxi squad, moving guys onto the IR, trading players that can benefit another owner that just kind of give a handcuff. Before I remove anyone from my roster completely, I try and, hey, does this player make sense for this other team? Does somebody have Rico Dowdle and I'm trying to get rid of Ezekiel Elliott? Well, hey, why don't you have the Cowboys backfield instead? As opposed to just Rico Dowdle, because Ezekiel Elliott's probably getting the carries inside the 5-yard line. That's a way that you can kind of trim the fat on your roster, keep it to a nice minimalist roster, but at the same time play within your league parameters. Because Bob, you and I are in a C2C league. You can roster 50 guys. It's ridiculous. But just make sure that you're doing that, because I want to make sure people don't just take your point for the face value of, trim the fat here. Well, if you can hold the fat and that player one day is worth something, then sure, maybe at some point, in the offseason, Jordan Mason was like, oh God, get this guy off my roster. Now he's the 49ers RB2. So again, if it's within your league parameters and it is not stopping you from whatever it is you're trying to do, whether that's compete, whether that's rebuild, then do it. Absolutely. 100%.
One point that Mike brings up a lot that I think is a great point with this point is, if a player is replaceable, and can I find this exact player out on waivers right now? If the answer is ever yes, I'm probably not holding out of that player anymore. I'd rather find another upside swing, whatever the case is, somebody who's maybe a little younger, who hasn't had a chance, maybe open up to new opportunity, whatever the case is. But Zach, 100%, if you have the space, keep it. But these types of players are the first ones to go. The ones that are just, they're clogging your roster. You're rarely ever thinking about putting them into a starting lineup, but you just have them to have them. I want to find ways to get him off my roster. But Zach, kick it to your next point here. What do you got for us?
Yeah, Bob, we quite often during the offseason have talked about veteran players, players that for the past few seasons have scored points. And for me, it's just not believing in veteran proven point scorers. There are so many teams. It's like sometimes I don't want to do the work for the owner that I'm talking to, but I'm like, you have a very good team. Brandon Cooks would make a lot of sense for you. You know, he could be a flex fill-in, he could be a bye week fill-in. I think he's going to do pretty good this season as long as he stays healthy. He's the Cowboys wide receiver too, but he is 30 years old, 30, 31, whatever it may be. You know, and it's like you have those owners that are like, that's too much age, and I'm like, it's also a lot of production too. Like if you're trying to win, there are a lot of those players that still exist in the dynasty universe. Proven veteran point scorers can help your teams if you are trying to win. Good examples: Mike Evans, still a top 10 wide receiver in production last year, even though you could have bought him for wide receiver 2 prices last offseason, maybe even this offseason. I'm not too sure because I have enough shares of Mike Evans where I believed in him last offseason. Another one we talked about probably ad nauseum this offseason, Bob, is James Conner, right? Just a running back that you can probably start for the majority of the season so long as he's healthy. He's 29 years old. If we're trying to win, I know you don't care. I certainly don't care. You go into the mentality of, I'll just carry this player on my roster until their dynasty value expires because their production has been worth it. I can't sit here and say it will be worth it. That's the gamble you take. As Bob said earlier, that's the game we play. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But we feel that quite often with these sorts of players that we win more often than we lose. Another good example is Evan Ingram at the tight end position. 30 years old is nothing. It's nothing. And the prices that you've been able to buy him this offseason has been pretty cheap. So you can look at almost every position and find older players that you may be able to get at cheaper prices. But a lot of times, Bob, I talk to owners or you've picked up a roster review and it's like, and I know you're going to talk about this next. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but you look at this team and you're like, go buy some vets, man. Like, it's time. It's time for you to jump in and get some veteran, proven point scoring players on your roster.
I'm a big fan of buying in on bets, especially when you're trying to turn the corner. It's one good way that you can kind of turn a rebuild around a little more quickly. It's one of those ways to expedite a rebuild, as opposed to, waiting for all of your draft picks to mature, trading out for just draft picks, and then waiting for all of your draft picks to mature. That can take a heckin' long time, and especially if your draft picks do not pan out. So things to think about, ways to expedite those rebuilds. Buying veterans is a great way to do it. Another great way to do it is trading away your rookie draft capital at its peak value before the rookie draft, even maybe in the rookie draft, whatever the case is. But to your point here, something I've talked about a couple of times over the past couple of weeks here, the value cliff falls off before the production cliff of veterans, because in Dynasty, and this is maybe something that we see improving with the community. I think we maybe see this improving
100%.
That people are just, oh, it's Dynasty, man. If they're over X age, they're trash. And it's like, well, that's just not really factual, especially when you're talking about a just competitive roster. I know you talked about earlier that you want to have this long-term plan. The thing is when you invest in these veterans after their value cliff dives, they're still going to produce after that value cliff. So you're buying in a heck of a lot cheaper for a productive asset that you've hopefully, over the course of your rebuild, spent time building up assets that you can afford to trade second-round picks for. James Conner, Mike Evans, insert veteran name here, that can help fully flush out your competitive roster and help you win a championship when you're ready to turn that corner. So I 100% advocate this deal here, buying in on the cheaper vets as they become available, and just kind of, yes, you are taking a risk, but that's the cost that's baked into the cost at this point, and if you have other assets to burn, quote unquote, burn, you're using them wisely, in my opinion. Even though the value cliff has died, it's not going to die much further before it goes fully off the rails when they're like hardly rosterable anymore. But I'm big in on this, Zach. I think it's a great point. If you were trying to compete, finding assets that are going to put up points at a discount is always a good strategy. Moving on to the next one here, and a lot of teams are going to start rebuilds this year. And one of the things I advise against is rebuilding too hard. And unfortunately, we've seen this with some roster reviews because every roster inherently has value to it, whether it's in picks, players, whatever the case is. Every player has a value, every pick has a value, whatever the case is. And whatever it starts out with is not always what you end up with when you start selling off all your assets. Sometimes you are just too concerned. You sell off too much for too little in return. And that's always a little bit concerning. But this is particularly concerning when you work yourself into a hole you can't get out of easily. If you sell low, you're not getting the right value back to eventually turn it around. Rebuilding is fun. I totally get it. 100% agree. But whether it's an orphan team you're molding into your own or a team that you've decided needs retooling, you're now all of the wiser. However, it's easy to get carried away. It's easy to say, hey, I'm rebuilding and put every one of your players up on the block all at once. It's easy to get carried away. If you're going to the scorched earth route, which is just selling everybody, getting everybody off your roster for the most part, or you have very few players to build around to begin with, it's extremely important to get as much value as possible for the assets you're looking to move. And a good way to ensure this is by moving players in season when they're the most valuable and moving picks after the season before your rookie drafts or during your rookie drafts when they're at their most value. Use that value cycle that the players and picks fall into when it's after your rookie drafts and or in the season. Players become more valuable. They're scoring points now or they're scoring points next. However, after the regular season, before your rookie drafts, picks are more valuable because they're the next sexy thing. They're the thing people need next. So their value just naturally inflates. And if you do it the opposite way around, you buy players in season, you're paying more to get them. And if you're buying picks in the offseason, you're paying more to get them. So buy players in the offseason, like we are kind of now with these older vets, and buy picks during the regular season because they're just going to be that much cheaper, especially if you're buying from the right teams. You're trying to get some competitive assets off your roster, make them pay up, especially if you can get in on the value of the arms race. That's always a good way to get extra value. So don't rebuild too hard. Whenever we go into a roster review or any rebuild, at the end of the day, you have to fill, when you want to compete again, you have to fill X number lineups. Start 9, start 10, start 11, start 12, start less, start more, whatever it is. You need to fill those lineup spots again. So you need to ultimately build up enough assets to fill those spots and then more. You need to keep that in mind. Because if you build too far away from that, and maybe you get a bunch of first round picks, but you may be only filling like 60% of your starting slots and a handful of backup slots, you're going to be a little short. You're going to come up short in that rebuild a little bit. And that would be the definition of rebuilding too hard for me. Zach, feel free to tune into this one before we dive on into your last point.
You're not going to win a championship with a team 25 years and under. I've never seen it before. And maybe that exists to you, but it is, again, the exception to the rule. It's not something to use as a model of consistency. Like, ooh, I did it great. I'm happy for you. Most people don't do that. You need to be supplementing your roster. And a lot of times it's with waiver wire players. Like good examples was Joe Flacco last season. You talked about Justin Jackson earlier. Justin Jackson was in people's lineups in week 17 2 years ago. You need to be able to embrace the process of veteran players, older players, or just point scoring players, whatever their age is, because Adam Thielen might provide you some value this season, and he's 34 years old, and that sounds disgusting. And the same with Taysom Hill. It sounds disgusting, but it's also just true. You might be able to get wide receiver 3 numbers out of Adam Thielen, who at the beginning of last season was like, top 15 wide receiver? As gross as it sounds, you have to be able to embrace those things because you're going to be in a perpetual rebuild if you're just keeping the team 23, 24, 25 years old. Oh, Garrett Wilson's 28. We got to move on. It's time to move on. Like, what? Come on. Why are we doing that right now? So I love this point. It's great. And I'm just going to transition here to my next point, Bob. This is something I'm wholeheartedly passionate about. I'm going to get up on my soapbox. The game we play, Bob, is called Dynasty Fantasy football. It's not redraft. It's not keeper. Hopefully it's not best ball. It's dynasty, okay? It's a 12-month game. It's not 5. It's not 7. It's not 8. It's not 9. It's not 10 months. You need to be locked in 12 months of the year. This doesn't mean you need to be on the app every single day. But as we talked about earlier, you need to be in tune with what's going on around the NFL, training camp reports. Let me give you a perfectly beautiful example of a player that I think so fits this point so well. And yes, you could say that this player fits the pay attention to the training camps. Like, yes, but I wanted to talk about being engaged 12 months of the dynasty year. And that's Jordan Whittington, who right now seems like the very gadgety player for the Rams. They've talked about giving him snaps at running back, fullback, wide receiver, the slot, outside, all that kind of good stuff. I have no idea where Jordan Whittington slots in right now. Probably the wide receiver 4 on that team. Somebody goes down, he can come in. But at the same time, nobody drafted Jordan Whittington in the rookie drafts. Nobody. And you saw reports after rookie OTAs, oh, this guy's really interesting. And even at that point, myself, Bob, I did not have any shares of Jordan Whittington. But I saw the reports, and I was like, okay, whatever. The Rams are pretty loaded at wide receiver. They brought back DeMarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell's there. Obviously, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are there. I'm like, they just don't really have the room. And then as the training camp goes on and on in July, Jordan Whittington is making plays. People are talking about Jordan Whittington. And then the first preseason game happens, Bob. And I watched that. And that dude was everywhere. And he was good. He was making people miss. He was getting first downs when he was being thrown the ball before the first down mark. Like, he was doing things that you want your football players on the field as a coach to do. And then after the game, Sean McVay comes out and is glowing about Jordan Whittington. It's like, okay, like, I got to pay attention to this. I got to go pick up Jordan Whittington where I can. And there are a lot of people that are just now coming back. They're coming out from under the rocks that they've been in for 3-4 months since the rookie draft. They're like, oh, what happened in the dynasty season? Like, it's like, whoa, this is a 12-month game. If you can just hone in on, again, you don't have to be on the app every single day, but if you can just be a little bit more in tune with the game in the months that don't count, right? Obviously, we are at the precipice of the season, and that's great, and it's all fun. But at the same time, there are 8 months where we are not playing games in Dynasty Fantasy Football. And if your team stinks, more like 9 months, when you can be tuned into these kinds of reports in May, in June, in rookie OTAs, where it's just the rookies. They're reporting to camp. And then as we get to training camp in July, if you can just be plugged in and tuned in and playing your waiver wire, you can pick up some of these players. We talked about Puka Nacua earlier. Puka Nacua is a great example of this 2 years ago. I didn't want to do it again and again with Puka. I just wanted to bring a more recent example of a player that we don't know what's going to happen, but maybe we'll see in week 1, Jordan Whittington has a few catches on the field, so on and so forth. I don't know. But I'm just saying, if you were away for the last 3 or 4 months, then you missed out on a potential player like a Jordan Whittington who can help you, if not this year, maybe next year. We don't know. You just don't have that opportunity. The only way you can get Jordan Whittington now is trading for him, because he is not available on any single waiver wire. And if you play the 7-month dynasty game, then you lost. You lost on Jordan Whittington. You lost at a potential value opportunity either at some point later this offseason, at some point later this regular season, or in the offseason next year.
Yeah, man, you can't argue with that. I mean, this is just one instance, but you talked about, this is kind of a smoke that's been building. There's been breadcrumbs to this over time. And it's if you are only tuned in for half the year, let's say, you might only see one of those reports. But if you are tuned in for the full year in some capacity, it doesn't, like you said, don't have to be checking the app every day. Don't have to be checking every single team every day, whatever the case is. But finding ways to be tuned in, a great way to do that is finding a Discord or any community that you like, trust, want to be a part of, want to get into more of. Ours, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Head in the Discord for a free week trial there. If you want to check us out, there's plenty of other ones out there as well. Join the one you like the most, or just as many as you like. That's fine too. Finding ways to stay engaged, that's just one of them. But if you come in, you might only have half the picture if you only see one hype piece. But the fact is, this has been ongoing since rookie OTAs. This is just one prime example. There's plenty more out there. Whether Whittington amounts to too much at this point, I think he'll amount to something. I have him as the wide receiver 4, like you mentioned now, but I could easily see him, working his way up the totem pole. Cooper Kupp not been a model of health these last 2 seasons. Demarcus Robinson, as I guess fun as he is, has not been awesome throughout the course of his career. So I could see him kind of leapfrogging him on the totem pole as well for certain packages and whatnot. So either way, don't hate this. Love the concept overall. Stay involved one way or another. If it's not your league chats, if you're sick of your league mates, go hang out with someone on Discord, some folks on Discord, and enjoy that much. Speaking of being active, my final point, this is something we talk about in bits and pieces over time, but value scouting is one of my favorite things to do. And it's another one of those things where it's like, Bob, what the heck are you talking about? When you say value scouting, there's rookie scouting, there's whatever scouting, there's high school scouting if you're in C2C leagues. It's crazy. I'm not looking forward to that. But being in our first C2C league. But value scouting, this is a concept that will take practice and time, but you might not even realize that you've already been doing this a little bit. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Don't be ashamed if you have not. But start looking at players and whether they're on your team or not, and think how they can generate value to myself or another team. Whatever the case is. And one of my favorite concepts this past offseason has been, would they make a good launch pad to tier up to a better player? Ask myself that question. Are they tiered very closely? Jordan Addison was a player who was valued in the upper wide receiver 20s. He would have made a great launch pad to go get somebody in that wide receiver 12 to 15 range, the Chris Olaves, Jalen Waddles, Drake London type player. And I'd obviously have to add something to Jordan Addison to do that, but it'd be, he's a fun enough name where people were hyping him up, obviously, to be valued in the wide receiver 20 range before all the DUI stuff. And now you have Sam Darnold as the starting quarterback, probably a little less appealing to a lot of players, a lot of managers, but that is just one prime example. Another way you could look at players, are they a starting quality player that I can buy that's being undervalued due to an injury or a string of bad weeks over the course of the season? Somebody that I think is going to be a great buy value scouting wise this season is going to be TJ Hawkinson. I know I don't shut up about the guy, but he's going to be undervalued because he's injured starting the year, and he's probably not going to play well coming back from the injury. And on top of that, the trifecta, probably not going to be in a great offense with Sam Darnold or Nick Mullins or whoever they get to play quarterback there. Not a game I love to play, but I know some players or some managers like this a little bit more. Is this player a buy low that I could possibly flip later? If Dynasty House Flipper is your game, here is your name. That is the move there. But is this a player a handcuff that might come in handy for myself or someone else down the road if they're on my roster? Maybe they're on waivers. You never know how backfields are going to develop over the course of the season. Some players can come out of nowhere. We've seen it happen before. Ronnie Rivers was a thing. And granted, he didn't do much of anything on the field, but he was a thing for a while where he was getting reps. It's like, oh man, got to go get this guy and other players of that ilk. It's just the first one that happened to come to my mind. And if you are getting players off of the waivers, is this just a player that has potential to put up usable fantasy points that I'm getting off the waivers for free, or some fab that I can either flip or put into my lineup, whatever the case is, depending on your league settings? Obviously, you might have viable players on waivers, you might not. Ultimately, it boils down to, in what ways can I extrapolate more value out of a player than what I acquired them for? That's the big question. And is that even possible with the player in question? And if the answer to that is no, then the answer to that is bye-bye to that player, or bye-bye-bye, since we were in our boy band phase talking about the show before a little bit. Zach, feel free to talk about value scouting if you'd like to before we get the heck on out of here.
Yeah, this is such a good point. You brought TJ Hawkinson. You could just insert any player on the pup, right? At any point. Sure. Last season, good examples of this towards the end of the season: Joe Burrow, Mark Andrews, right? Just guys that you were value scouting for the next season, guys that you could have done it now or even in your rookie draft, like Jonathan Brooks. You probably had to spend a late first-round pick, but if he hadn't been hurt, probably a mid-first-round pick, maybe a little bit earlier. You just don't know how that's going to turn out. So Love this point. I mean, God, I live by this point. You know that I am the walking, breathing value scouting person. That is, somebody gets hurt, and I'm like, hey, what's up? Do you want to sell? That's kind of my thing. So great point by you, Bob.
Well, with all that said, we have to say bye to all of y'all. But hey, to the incoming season, the season be with you all. But with all that said, we are going to get the heck on out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.